condemned for its act to do so.
Senator Reynolds.
Very much, Deputy President. It's with great sadness that I rise to speak on the repeal of the cashless debit card, which currently is used by over 4,000 fellow West Australians in the Goldfields and the East Kimberley regions. These are unquestionably some of our state's most vulnerable people. I've gone through a wide range of emotions since the introduction of this ill-conceived and botched piece of legislation, from disbelief to great anger and sadness now for the inevitable results that this will cause on the lives of so many Australians. The cashless debit card was introduced by the previous coalition government as a means of ensuring that those receiving welfare payments were spending taxpayers' money on the necessities such as food, household bills and clothes, and not on habits that enable destructive lifestyles. And this is one thing that I think those opposite have seemed to have forgotten, that it is not just about the life of the person on the card. It is also about the lives that they impact. So it is about the women, the children and the elderly in their lives that have more money and are subject to far less violence than they had been. And I still cannot get my head around the pious self-righteousness of colleagues on the other side who have callously put ideology above the needs of Australia's most vulnerable. It is my opinion, and that of those on this side of the chamber, that the card should be extended and not repealed. It is truly mind-blowing just how incompetent the new government has managed this issue. As we kept hearing from those opposite, this was a policy we took to the election. Well, they may have taken the policy to the election, but they certainly didn't take an implementation plan to the election. They certainly didn't take any consultation to the election, and they certainly had none of that after the election when they introduced this legislation. And in fact, there is no evidence that they properly consulted with any of the communities who chose to have the CDC in their electorates. And then how they could think that those in this place and the other place would allow them to steamroll such appalling legislation through this place without having, and then being forced to have, the quickest of all possible inquiries. And since then, the government has been forced into, as we'll hear shortly in the committee stage of this bill, into embarrassing backflips time and time again. But these are concessions that they're now making because they've botched it the whole way along, again impacting on over 14,000 Australian lives. They've botched it and they're now about to make it worse, because what they don't realise, and clearly you have never been up to any of these communities saying, oh, well, look, we'll make it optional. But if you're an abused woman who is on the card, what do you think your partner is going to do? Say, oh, yes, no problem, you just keep that card, don't worry about giving me the cash. It makes women in particular more vulnerable than less vulnerable, and shame on you. You've forced yourself into making these ill-considered and certainly not consulted amendments. It is a disgrace. So now we've seen the Labor government on the run make new amendments to this legislation, which we're about to debate shortly. Again, you are better to withdraw this legislation rather than try and steamroll these ill-conceived amendments that will make people's life even worse than what you are proposing to do in the first place. Despite these new amendments, the intention of the bill still is to repeal the cashless debit card, which was put into communities as an important financial management tool. Again, it is all about helping our most vulnerable. And then those opposite were trying to say, well, the Australian National Audit Office recommended that it be repealed. Well, please bring in that report and show us exactly where the ANAO said that this should be repealed, because on our side, we can find nowhere where the ANAO report said that it needs to be repealed. That is simply a lie. That is simply a great big fib by multiple members opposite. The reduction of taxpayer-funded access to drugs, alcohol and gambling products has significantly reduced alcohol and drug abuse, assaults, rapes and murder. The evidence is there. Now, those opposite during the debate have been saying, oh, well, we haven't been able to find anyone to really talk to tell us about this. Well, if you don't go out and talk to the communities, of course you're not going to find anybody to comment on this. Again, with ungodly haste, shunted the inquiry through this place from the committee, and you did not visit one of the trial sites and talk to one member in my own home state of Western Australia. So, of course, you didn't find anybody in Western Australia because you didn't go and talk to them. So, after all of this backlash, the Albanese government has finally conceded abolishing the cashless debit card, oh gee, golly gosh, will lead to more violence, more alcohol and drug abuse, childhood neglect and violence in vulnerable communities, including, of course, in my home state of Western Australia. Now, their announcement of nearly $50 million for alcohol and drug treatment service is a complete admission of failure of this policy, that it will cause more harm and that more of the support will be required as a direct result of what they were proposing. So shame on the Labor government for doing what they have done, leaving great uncertainty in these communities amongst Australia's most vulnerable. And then, surprise, surprise, at the 11th hour, very shortly in this place, they're coming in with amendments which admit they were wrong. But these are amendments that haven't been consulted across any of these communities. So the government has introduced this atrocious legislation without regard or consultation of those that it will impact the most. So much for an Indigenous voice. So much for an Indigenous voice. We have had two amazing Indigenous senators, Senator Nampijinpa Price and Senator Little. They have spoken with first-hand knowledge. And anybody who listened to Senator Nampijinpa Price tell about her own personal experience with this, and you still think that this card is good, you have no heart and you have no shame. This ideological opposition to the CDC will leave thousands of Australians vulnerable. So let me make it very clear. This government and this parliament has not consulted with Western Australians who have this card and who've chosen to have this card in their communities. So given that the cashless debit card is only being used in 6 places, and 2 of them are in Western Australia, in the East Kimberley and the Goldfields regions, the inquiry, this Senate's inquiry, conducted not a single, not one, hearing in either the Kimberley or the East Goldfields. Not one. And not only that, when they were finally forced to actually consult, they were shamed into forced into consulting with some of these regions. Guess how many days? Guess how many days the local councils got to deal with and to provide some input? 3 days, 3 working days to comment on 4 documents. Now, that is not genuine consultation, and that is a disgrace. So the East Kimberley as a whole was the site where the most problems were reported, and they were reported before the introduction of the CDC. And it was also the site that reported the strongest positive change, particularly in relation to alcohol. East Kimberley was the site affected by the most severe alcohol problems, but has been the site that has demonstrably recorded the greatest reduction since the introduction of the card. The CDC was very positive in preventing humbugging. Those vulnerable people who are subject to humbugging by their family and by their friends, their lives have been improved by the cashless debit card, because no longer can their relatives come and put their hand out and ask for money when they have cash. They can no longer stand at the ATM waiting for that money to come out and take it away from mothers and children. That is one of the benefits of this card. So I'd just like to conclude on a couple of comments from leaders in my own home state of Western Australia, both from the Kimberley, the East Kimberley, and also the Goldfields. People who those opposite and this Senate committee really obviously made no effort to talk to. So the first one is the Mayor of Kalgoorlie-Boulder, John Bowler, and he said this: "It almost seems that they, Labor, are putting the cart before the horse." The Shire of Laverton said the lack of consultation is profound on the government's part, and the words and the rhetoric do not go well for the future of Laverton. And as local governments do, we will pick up the pieces with other state government agencies who work under trying conditions and see the community continue. The CDC has brought some sanity to the people's lives, as most of the spending allocation is to purchase food for women and children and the elderly and the other essentials of life. Is this submission the motive? Yes, it is. It is because we believe and have seen firsthand the benefits of the CDC and the impact upon Laverton, for which I have called home for over 65 years, and the generation before me as Shire President. Ian Truss, the director of the fabulous Woonan Foundation in Kununurra, who knows firsthand the foundation deal with the health and the lives of so many in the East Kimberley. And Ian has said this: "It reduces the alcohol violence and the harassment of the elderly and the vulnerable for cash when they go to use the ATM. The cashless card is not a silver bullet, but it is something we can build on." But now there is no plan as to what happens after the CDC is abolished. We are now left in a vacuum. The government, he also went on to say, the government says if we want to go down that path of keeping income management, that it has to be a community decision. But there is no information about how they want us to arrive at that decision or what the replacement could be. Classic Labor policy on the run, on the back of a coaster, a great idea, but with nothing behind it. It is inconceivable to me, and I know to all of us on this side of the chamber, that any government or any senator would knowingly inflict more pain and suffering on vulnerable women, children and elders. But that is exactly what this piece of botched legislation that Labor are about now to seek to amend, that will make it even worse than it currently is. All I can say is shame on every one of you, because we know what will be happening out in communities if this passes here today. It will be more grog, it will be more violence, it will be more rapes, it will be more abuse, it will be more child neglect, and it will be more murder and death. You cannot say you were not warned. You cannot say you did not know, and yet you continue to push this based on blind ideology. Shame on you all. Thank you, Mr.